Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about film adaptation theory. Just the basics though. This is a little bit of an introduction to the very idea of taking something like a novel and putting it up on the big screen. So I'm going to talk about adaptation. Now by adaptation, I always mean film adaptation because adaptation can apply to a variety of things. So we're talking about film adaptation, and again, it's the idea of taking a text based on words like a script or a novel and moving it, getting it from the novel to the screen. So what exactly is going on when we move from one medium to another? So channeling our inner Socrates, we should always ask for a definition. What do we mean by adaptation? Film adaptation. What are we talking about? But before I go into that, it's a good idea to talk a little bit about judgments. So we have to look at what judgments are. Now, this is a very complex area of philosophy. Lots of philosophers have written, reams of material on what judgments are, how do they relate to propositions, how does language figure, what are psychological processes are involved, are there concepts, that are, not mental that are involved, but Platonic in nature. So there's a big story here about trying to articulate what judgments are. I'm not going to get into all that because, frankly, we don't really need it to do what we want to do here. So what is a judgment? Yeah, that's a puzzle in and of itself, but we're just going to really consider it as an assertion. Like I've got here, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, the red hat is red, the cat is on the mat, or the statue is on the table. These are just straightforward little judgments. And we would say also that there are different kinds of judgment, right? Look at the first one, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. That's an arithmetic judgment, or sometimes say it's a proposition or an arithmetic sentence. That is a kind of assertion about the relationships between concepts. The second one, the red hat is red, that's a little bit bizarre. That's what philosophers would call a tautology. Of course, it's true. Right? It'd be odd if you said the red hat is red is false. How could that be? You're simply saying the red hat is red. You're saying almost the same thing twice. But nonetheless, it is a judgment and it makes perfect sense, although it might, as you might say, not terribly informative. The other one, the third one, the cat is on the mat. That's a different kind of judgment because it would be sensible. You could say, well, it might not be true, or if you say the statue is on the table, that might be true. Well, it is now because it's sitting there. But if I pick the statue up and move it, then the statement, the statue is on the table, would be not true. So the truth value of something like the statue is on the table or the cat is on the mat, those can change. Something like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, that's true, but could that really change and one day be false? That seems odd to say that. The red hat is red, that has to be true. That could never really change. So some statements are assertions about the everyday world that we live in, like the statues on the table. And other statements seem to be kind of different. They don't seem to be statements about the world really at all, like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. However, without going into all the details of this, we would say that these kinds of statements, 2 plus 2 is 4, red hat is red, cat is on the mat, or the statue is on the table, they're objective. Right? It would be really odd to say, well, maybe 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is true for you, but it's not true for me, or the red hat is red is true for someone else, or it's not true for those people over there. And even the statement like the cat is on the mat, or the statue is on the table, we would regard that as objective in the sense that we could come to agreements on how to check it, right? Because we would say things like, well, put the proper lighting conditions in it and go have a look, and it's objective in the sense that people could come to agreements about it. Now, to go into the real details now of how to spell out conditions under which you can be sure things are objective, that can get pretty tricky, and fortunately, we don't have to go into all those details here. But some judgments regarding their objectivity are a little trickier than these. So what I'm saying so far is that these three little judgments, the arithmetic one, this little tautology, the red hat is red and the cat is on the mat, which is an empirical statement, it might be difficult to spell out exactly how they're objective, but most people would pretty well think, yeah, they are objective. But take a look at some other kinds. Stealing is wrong. That book is really good. The movie is better. That movie is better than the novel. Are those objective? It becomes a little trickier, right? Because these are different kinds of judgments. Well, it's not clear. Like when you look at a judgment like stealing is wrong, is that objective? And if so, how does that work? How do you unpack the objectivity? And this is a puzzling question indeed. How to unpack the objectivity if there is objectivity? Maybe there isn't. But if you say something like stealing is wrong is an objective statement, you could be right, but someone could just then say, well, how do you know that it's objective? What makes it objective? Right? Is it just simply because of the laws? Well, then stealing is illegal. That's different than saying stealing is wrong. If you say stealing is wrong in a moral sense, you'd have to tell, or at least try to tell, some kind of story as to what makes stealing wrong, and not just simply refer to laws. And this can be amazingly tricky. And philosophers have articulated all kinds of positions in trying to explain why a moral judgment is objective. And there's all kinds of agreement in some areas, there's all kinds of disagreement. But the thing about this is that when you try to explain something, again, like stealing is wrong, and you try to explain why it's objective, you're going to have to try and tell a story of what there is in the world that makes it objective. If I go back to the statement, the statue is on the table, what makes that objective? Well, you'd say, well, the world does, right? Because the way the world is organized, independently of what I happen to think or you happen to think, that's what makes that statement objective, and we can go check. But is the world organized in any clear way that we can see, that we could then just say, oh yeah, that's what makes a claim like stealing is wrong completely objective? Again, very tricky stuff. So, key thing, when you look at statements like stealing is wrong, that book is really good, that seems to be a judgment of taste. That movie is better than the novel. Again, a judgment of taste. So we've gone from a moral judgment in the first one, and the other two are aesthetic judgments. How are aesthetic judgments objective? If they are, what makes them objective as well? So whenever you say a statement or a judgment is objective, you can always be asked, and you should be thinking, okay, what makes that objective? Is it just my feelings or whatnot? And it often gets into a number of complexities involved. Some people think that in order to say in order to have an objective moral claim, you're going to need something that's outside the physical world, something beyond the physical. And some people said that's why you need something like a religious notion, like a god or whatever, to make the objective conditions of moral judgments. So just on the basis of analyzing a very straightforward sentence, or shall I say appearingly or deceivingly straightforward sentence, like stealing is wrong, you can get into big discussions about the fundamental nature of the universe. Now, before you say, okay, well, I'm going to maybe shy away from this objective thing because that's going to get me into all kinds of difficult and complex things, why don't we just go and say something like this? Stealing is wrong because basically cultures say it's wrong. There's really no more you can do with that. Stealing is wrong because I just think it's wrong. It bothers me. It's offensive. The notion of stealing is offensive. And in the end, something like a moral judgment is really like an expression of taste, right? I find, stealing distasteful. Acts of murder, in the end, maybe I can't give a grandiose objective classification or an explanation of why they're objective. So I'm just going to go and say, well, cultures don't approve of them or people don't approve of them. They're ultimately expressions of likes or dislikes. Same thing when it comes to aesthetic judgments. When you say that book is really good, all you're really saying is that you really liked it. Or if you say it's really awful, you're not really saying anything terribly objective. You're just reporting on your feelings. But think about that. If you shy away from the objective approach to moral judgments and aesthetic judgments, and you shy away from the objective approach because of all the complexities that you get into, those metaphysical things of God and the universe and all that stuff, and you go towards a more subjective notion that you say moral judgments, aesthetic judgments are really just expressions of feelings, you get some other problems there too. There's baggage. So keep in mind that the positions you take, you don't get off lightly. You basically have certain kinds of baggage that come along. I want to talk about buttermilk for a second here. If you move away from the objective notions and you just say, well, look, stealing is wrong is really just an expression of my dislike of stealing. That book is really good. It's just really, again, just an expression of I just liked it. Or it's bad, I disliked it. Think about that. If you're talking to a friend about something like a book and he says, oh yeah, that book is great, and you say, no, it's not, and at the end of the day, if these are just expressions of your feelings, think about what's really going on. What has buttermilk got to do with this? Well, to me, my grandmother loves buttermilk. She thinks it's great, right? I think it's disgusting, okay? Well, we're not really, in the end, talking about buttermilk, are we? We're talking about how we feel about it. So when I say buttermilk is awful, I'm really saying sort of a coded way or a shortened way of saying the reaction that I have when I drink that stuff is one of disgust, or I don't enjoy it, it's a terrible experience, right? So I'm actually reporting on my feelings. Likewise for my grandma. So we're not, and this is the key point, we're not really talking about buttermilk. We're talking about our feelings. Right? So you have to be very careful when you go down the subjective route that in the end you don't withdraw completely from the world and turn into just simply a reporter of your own feelings. And that often happens when people go down the subjective route and then turn away from all the objectivity and end up turning all these judgments, like stealing is wrong, moral judgments, that book is really good, aesthetic judgments, and turning them just into reports of feelings. Why is that so bad? Well, because in the end, you're not really communicating with people. You're just simply reporting on your own inner states. There's nothing contradictory. If between my grandmother and myself, we're not contradicting each other, because I'm saying that my feelings are that I don't like buttermilk, and hers are she does. There's no contradiction there. We're not even really having a real discussion. So, and the same thing about cultural codes. If you simply say, well, morals or ethics is just culturally based, then ethics of one culture is just different than the ethics of another. This is the baggage. So, in that way, you're going to what's called cultural relativism, or you could have aesthetic relativism, and that you can't really make any serious claims to adjudicate between cultures, for instance. So one culture treats its minorities in a certain way, it's just a different way than another culture. So a brutal dictatorship, for instance, to take sort of the extreme example, a brutal dictatorship that treats its minorities horribly is just another form of government that just treats its minorities differently than, say, a liberal democracy and how it treats its minorities. Very few people are willing to go down this route of a really hardcore sense of relativism. Same thing. If you go down the path of aesthetic relativism and say, it's just all art, it's just in the eye of the beholder. By the way, Plato would have thought that is an extremely anthropocentric view to say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But he might be wrong. It might be the case that it is totally subjective. But think again of the baggage. You would be committing yourself to saying things like, the Mona Lisa is simply just another painting alongside of, let's say, me going and taking some oils and splashing them on a canvas. That's just another painting. One is not better than the other, right? So in the end, you just have a form of aesthetic relativism. So if you go down the objective path, you get into that complex problem of how are things objective and trying to spell that out, and you get into metaphysics and all kinds of interesting and tricky and difficult debates. But if you run the other direction and you say, nah, it's not objective, it's all just in the eye of the beholder, whether it's a moral judgment or an aesthetic judgment, you could be sliding into certain forms of relativism, cultural relativism when it comes to morals, and aesthetic relativism when it comes to things like art. Okay, now this was a little bit of a philosophical interlude on the notion of judgment. As I said, I'm not going to go into all the details here. I just raised them so that you have a bit of an understanding. Let's now go back to our main topic adaptation. So armed with this idea that judgments can be tricky things, we're going to, more or less for the sake of our discussion, accept that you can, without us spelling out in detail, have objective aesthetic judgments, that it does make sense to say that something like the Mona Lisa is a better painting, a superior artistic product than let's say anything I could do if I just went into a studio. Or that, a great piece of music by Mozart is better than, some piece you just might happen to hear on the radio. And I'll refrain from giving any examples, lest I offend anyone. But that's what we're going to take, that you can have objective aesthetic judgments. All right, back to adaptation. What do we mean by saying that a book is adapted to the screen? That's our central problem. Now, the simplest answer might go like this. Well, you're just basically moving the story from one medium right to the other, right? So it's just a transfer. That's it. Why not go with that? Transfer. You just take all the stuff that's in the book and you dump it onto the screen. Well, you should think about this notion of transfer. What's the simplest form of a transfer? Because you could transfer things in various ways, and if you transfer them in different kinds of ways, you can change the object as you're moving it around. But let's think of transfer in a pure sense, where you're just basically just picking something up and moving it right across the room and dropping it off somewhere else. So something like a pure form of transfer of a novel might be, let's say I video the turning of the pages of a novel, and I video each page, and you just read the novel, and then I flip the page over, and then you read it, and that's a very simple form of transfer. More like the actual filming of just the words. In that case, the movie watcher watching that kind of film would be kind of like a novel, a reader of the novel. So if we went with that simplistic of notion, that straightforward notion of a transfer, I doubt if many people would say that I'm actually making a movie. Would we really say that filming the pages being turned of a novel is an adaptation of it in the sense of we've created a movie? I doubt that very many people would accept that. Maybe we would, but I think it's probably quite counterintuitive. And I think we'll let the matter rest there. But this also does raise the notion of what exactly are we going to call a movie? What exactly do we mean by all of our terminology? So this offers us our first result, though, this intellectual exercise of thinking about a pure transfer. Namely, that the transfer moves all of the novel, right, the whole thing, right, as you see visually, it's moved from one medium, basically the printed word, onto a filmed product. So it's a complete transfer of the novel to the film. So again, it would come with all of its associated points of contention, like whether or not this is a real film. But philosophically, what I want to say here is that what we've got is that transferring all the information is not going to be sufficient for an adaptation, right? It might be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient. Just dumping it all over is not going to enable us to say, oh yeah, we've got a movie now of that novel. Perhaps we would try something different, like a book on CD, where you read, where you have an actor, usually somebody who can read quite well, has good dynamics in the voice, and would then read it out loud. So there would be some kind of adaptation going on, because it's very interesting if you read something yourself and if you don't understand it, sometimes having someone else read it out loud and they pause at certain places or they emphasize certain words can actually make the experience of that given text quite different, and you can come to an understanding even if they're not actually saying anything different than just reading the words. So my point is that reading a text out loud can change and adapt and modify it in certain ways, even if you're not really changing the words. Just simple inflections and pauses and places where you emphasize or not can change how we experience meaning through a given object. Whether it's a male or a female voice, that can change things too. All kinds of things can influence how a reader or a listener will understand something. So, again, simply transferring the novel from one medium to another is not sufficient, But again, nobody's going to say, well, the book on CD, even though it might have modified things a bit, I don't think we're going to call books on CDs movies, even if you visually film someone reading the novel out loud. So again, what I'm getting at really here is the notion of adaptation is not self-evident. It's not clear exactly what this is going to mean, because we can put forth certain suggestions that don't seem to work, or don't seem to work with our intuitions. But we would say, though, that nonetheless, it is important that an adaptation captures some of the novel, right? So it would be really odd if someone said, well, the book on CD was actually better than the novel or whatnot. It doesn't seem to be quite what we're talking about with respect to the notion of adaptation. What I want to ask now is it necessary to get all the info, all the information from a novel to the new medium? Is that necessary for adaptation? Well, it seems very doubtful that anyone would want to argue that you have to get all the information. It's not sufficient to get it all, but most people would argue that it's not even necessary to get it all. Think about it. If you want to insist that everything has to be transferred from a novel to the screen, what you're really saying is that the novel itself is such a tight unity that every part matters absolutely to the notion of the novel, to the meaning of the novel, that to leave anything out is going to destroy that unity. This is very doubtful. Right? Think about it. When you've read a novel, do you remember every single part of it, every single little detail? Or do you often say, that was a great novel, I really liked the main theme of it or the main character, and then someone might say, well, what did you think about this other part? And you might say, geez, I don't quite remember reading all that, but that was interesting. Or you say, well, I didn't think that was that important, I really can't remember much. But then you wouldn't say, oh, well, because I don't remember everything in the novel, I didn't really read it, or I don't really have the novel with me or at my fingertips. You might say that I got the essence of the novel. I liked it, I thought it was great, and I really have retained what's important about the novel. So this would then say that, no, it's not the case that all the information from the novel must be transferred over or captured. So what we've got now is that it's not sufficient to transfer all the information over, and it's not even necessary. And we've introduced the idea of, well, I'm grasping the core of the novel, a central part of the novel. Well, this raises some other kinds of questions, because now we're going to start asking about, well, what's the central core of a novel? How do you determine that? That, too, is not going to be something self-evident. But this is a way we normally speak. I read this novel, I loved its central message, and how I'm going to integrate that message into my life. So what we have now in everyday language is what's often called the fidelity view of adaptation. Again, this is the view that says something like, well, it's the case that when I read a novel and I grasp that novel, I'm getting the central position of that novel. So a film then, if we expand this sort of everyday notion of adaptation when we're reading a novel and absorbing it, adapting it to our minds, what we really got is that a film, Y, whatever it happens to be, as an adaptation of a novel X, is when Y captures the essence of X. It gets the central meaning, the central story. That's what makes for an adaptation. That's what we're talking about. Not all the information, but the main, most important elements of the novel, the key things that are important to it, the important information. However you want to phrase that, the essence of the novel. And the more of X's essence, the more of the novel's essence that is captured, then we would say that's a better adaptation. And a really awesome, excellent, tremendous, perfect adaptation would be where the movie captures completely the essence of the novel. That is essentially how we speak quite often in ordinary language, and this is this fidelity view of adaptation. And I suspect, as I said, in ordinary language, everyday speech, this is really what we're talking about, and what most people say, what most people are thinking when they say, oh, I really liked that movie, it was great, it was like the book. All right, but we have to be a bit careful here. Again, as I keep stressing, Often things that we think are self-evident, they just aren't. Very few things, if anything, is really self-evident. And once again, we have to go, like we did with judgments, in a bit of the thickets and the wilderness of philosophy when we start talking about things in a little bit more detail. Well, if adaptation is going to be some sort of capturing of the novel's essence, naturally, we're going to have to say, what do we mean about being faithful to a novel? What exactly does that mean? What are we talking about when we say it's faithful? What do we mean by being faithful? How much do we have to be? Complete, partially faithful? Faithful to what exactly? What exactly do we mean by the essence? Well, usually we say something like, well, it's the meaning of the novel. Well, this too is problematic. How do you figure out exactly what the meaning of a novel is? Because it's very rare that the author, if the author is even the correct authority, will say, this is the meaning of the novel. Very often we'll read a novel and someone will say, oh, well, that passage, where that character experienced this or said that or whatnot, that was the essence of the novel. And sometimes we say, no, that's not the essence at all for me. So is it entirely subjective? Well, that raises all kinds of problems. Here I've illustrated. If you think that there is something that's truly the essence of a novel that we can just sort of move over and capture in a movie, you've got this kind of picture in your head. That the novel and the movie are two different objects, and the meaning sits above both of them. That somehow we can extract the meaning out of a novel and carry it across the room and dump it into a film. That meanings are somehow independent from the objects that they're embedded in, right? That is some like a little thing you can just cut out of the novel and lift and move over. Is that the right way to see the notion of meaning? So this is the thicket of philosophy that I'm talking about, is what exactly are we talking about when we talk about a meaning? Can you pull a meaning out of an object? Plato would say definitely, yes, this is how it works. That we do have concepts that are abstract, and we do have these abstract concepts that are independent of the world. And you can talk about objective meaning in this sense. But just consider what this involves. This really says something that you can talk about meaning independently of context, right? As the little meaning is up above and moving over from the novel to the movie or back, when sometimes people will novelize a film, that they've grasped the essence of the film. You really have this picture in your head. It's a very old and venerable tradition, the Platonic tradition, that says you can have completely decontextualized meaning. That is interesting. It's been defended a lot, but it's also been attacked to a great degree. And some people have said you cannot have decontextualized meanings. So, should we contemplate other approaches? Maybe moving away from the fidelity view, right? Where you're trying to capture essences, right? Maybe we could say something like, well, we shouldn't relate books and movies in this capture of essence, this fidelity view, this notion of moving meaning from one object to another. Maybe we should just say that reading books, watching movies are very independent activities. And we shouldn't always try to find some sort of channel that relates them. Maybe that's building a bridge between two shores that really don't share the same river. It's just a totally different thing to have a movie and to experience it. Much like thinking about how the actual medium changes the content of the object. All right, so this is going to broaden our original question. For now, we're going to say, okay, adaptation is, yeah, you could try and interpret it along the lines of fidelity, but maybe a good adaptation doesn't even have to be faithful to a novel. Maybe a good adaptation could look at a novel in a very different way. We could have much more abstract understandings. For instance, instead of capturing, let's say, the meaning of a novel, maybe a good adaptation, maybe a good film adaptation, captures more of the feeling, something hard to put into words. Maybe the emotions, and it does through very different characters. It might have characters that are not at all even in the novel. And for example, in Blade Runner, there is a main character in the movie that is not even a character in the novel, but tries to serve maybe to illustrate certain kinds of moods and themes and ideas. So we have a much more abstract understanding than simply lifting a meaning out and trying to put it back into into another object like a film. So lifting it out of the novel, putting the film, maybe that's too simplistic of an approach. So sometimes maybe music or other sort of film techniques may serve as vehicles of adaptation and be quite different than this notion of fidelity to meaning. And it could be something with emotions or whatnot. So it's possible that the fidelity view, of course, could be correct, but again, it's not self-evident. And maybe we should be thinking of adaptation in a broader sense. So what my main sort of point in this short video was to sensitize you to the complexities of the very concept of adaptation and the viewpoint chosen, how you choose to understand what it means to move, to transfer, to adapt a novel to a film. That viewpoint is not self-evident. It's going to presuppose a lot.